So what does this imply for the inflation outlook? So lots of information in front of you there. I think the key takeaway on the left-hand side is that's a long-term chart of inflation, Canada, U.S. going back to 1960. The key point there is wherever the U.S. leads, Canada does tend to follow. There really isn't that much daylight in our inflation performance between Canada and the U.S. It's true on the growth front as well. We don't tend to see very big separation on that front. In the last 60 years, we have actually had the identical inflation rate to the U.S. It's just for trivia buffs, it's in the high 3% range, which is very close to where we are today, as a matter of fact. That was heavily influenced by that wildness that we saw back in the 70s and early 80s. That's why it's as high as that. In the last 30 years, Canada has tended to have a somewhat lower inflation rate than the U.S., which flipped the switch from the prior 30 years. But very recently, we've actually moved a bit above the U.S., partly because of the weakness in the Canadian dollar. Now, looking at it in average terms, we think inflation will average about 4% this year. That's very close to where we are today. We think next year it's going to average about 3%. A nice step down, still too high for the central bank's comfort. We think maybe by the end of next year, we'll be getting closer to their range of about 2% or so. And that's an important factor to keep in mind later when I talk about the interest rate outlook. On the right-hand chart, that bar chart basically just drives home the point that this is just not a North American story by any means. We are not outliers. If anything, inflation's a little bit lower in North America than many other economies. Just the other day, Britain reported that their inflation's still about 7%. You can see Australia, Mexico, and the Euro area are all above us here in North America, or we here in North America. A couple months this year, Canada was actually below Japan. We are never below Japan in terms of inflation, so we are definitely not outliers on that front. You can see the exception that proves the rule, and the one outlier here is China that's had no inflation in the last 12 months. Now, I think that's good news for the rest of us because it means what we're going to import from China over the next year is likely to see very little pressure. And I'm here to tell you that despite all the talk about, supply chain issues and energy and food, which have all been important in driving inflation up, that's not where the pressure is anymore. The pressure is on services.